The moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. But beneath the polished walls of Windsor, a secret had been simmering for decades, quietly shaping the life of one of the world's most scrutinized men. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, had carried a weight invisible to most, a burden hidden behind public smiles, royal engagements, and charitable appearances. At 40 years old, he finally spoke the words that the world had long suspected, words that would send shockwaves through the monarchy and beyond. King Charles is not my biological father. Can you imagine hearing that about your own life? The very foundation of who you are, suddenly called into question? How do you even begin to process a revelation like this when your every move has been cataloged, commented on, and dissected by millions? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, whispers floated through palace corridors, subtle hints that something was different about Harry's resemblance, his mannerisms, even his temperament compared to his brother William. Insiders described a child who was more sensitive, more impulsive, more prone to questioning the structures around him. Some dismissed it as mere personality, the natural differences between siblings. But others remembered subtle clues, notes scribbled in diaries, half-hidden letters, a glance or a comment that hinted at a truth too complicated to speak aloud. And for Harry, these subtle hints coalesced into a nagging unease that followed him from childhood into adulthood. Imagine living under the constant weight of doubt, of wondering if the man everyone hailed as your father, the man whose image you have carried proudly, is not truly the man who gave you life. Harry's life has been a series of public contradictions. On one hand, he was the charming prince adored by the press, the young man who served his country, the philanthropist dedicated to causes ranging from veterans to mental health. On the other hand, he lived in a private world fraught with tension, secrecy, and emotional turbulence. Behind closed doors, family dinners and private holidays carried a different story. There were moments when he felt disconnected, isolated, even misunderstood. And it wasn't just the weight of being royal. It was the unspoken questions about identity, lineage, and belonging that gnawed at him. For decades, Harry held these feelings close, navigating a life where every decision, every emotion, could be twisted into headlines, memes, and public debates. Why did he finally choose 40 to speak out? Timing is everything. 40 is a milestone, a moment of reflection, of reckoning. It's a point when the past and the present collide, when choices demand clarity. For Harry, reaching this age meant looking back at a life lived in the shadow of secrets and deciding he could no longer carry the weight alone. It meant facing the reality of the truth, of the people around him, and of the world at large. The confession was not impulsive. It was deliberate, a carefully considered declaration meant to set the record straight, reclaim his narrative, and confront the consequences head-on. And yet, even with preparation, the moment was devastating, seismic in its implications. Can you imagine the tension in that room? The silence that must have followed as the words fell? The disbelief, the shock, the immediate rush of emotions? Harry's revelation is not just a personal story. It is a story that affects the monarchy, the line of succession, and the perception of the royal family around the world. The implications stretch far beyond his personal life. It calls into question the public image of King Charles, a man who has been portrayed as steadfast, loyal, and paternal. It shifts how William, Catherine, and the rest of the family navigate relationships, trust, and public responsibilities. And for the public, it redefines decades of media narratives, from childhood appearances to marriage, family, and charity work. We are left asking ourselves, what does this mean for the institution itself? For tradition? For the carefully curated stories the monarchy has shared for centuries? Every detail suddenly becomes fraught with new significance. The photographs, the official biographies, the casual comments overheard at family gatherings. Every story now carries the weight of possibility, the possibility that what we've been told is not the whole truth. In recounting this journey, we must remember the human side. Harry is more than a prince. He is a son, a husband, a father, and a man grappling with profound questions of identity. Imagine navigating your entire life with the looming shadow of uncertainty, the gnawing feeling that the foundation you've built upon might not be what you thought it was. There were moments of rage, of sorrow, of confusion, and moments of quiet reflection where he questioned everything he had known. The emotional journey is staggering: betrayal, grief, irony, humor, and even moments of relief as the truth finally crystallized. And for Meghan, standing beside him, there was the challenge of supporting her husband while navigating the volatile, relentless media attention and palace politics. Their partnership became a sanctuary, a private realm where Harry could confront the truth and plan the next steps, away from prying eyes and judgment. Even as he prepared to reveal the truth, Harry knew that the world would react with fascination, outrage, and disbelief. He anticipated media storms, social media debates, and endless analysis. Yet he also understood that withholding this revelation would continue to erode his sense of self, his integrity, and his connection to the people who mattered most. By choosing honesty, he reclaimed agency over his story, but he also opened a Pandora's box. Every relationship, every trust, every family dynamic was now vulnerable to the ripple effects of this revelation. And for the viewers, for those of us watching from afar, it forces a reckoning with our own assumptions, biases, and the power of lineage and identity in shaping a person's life. So why are we telling this story now? Because the truth is finally out, and the world must grapple with it. Because for the first time, Harry has spoken openly about a secret that has long shaped his life in silence. And because the consequences, both personal and public, are just beginning to unfold. As we explore the details, the whispers, the evidence, and the reactions, prepare for a journey into a world that has been meticulously guarded, yet fraught with human drama, irony, and complexity. This is not just a royal story. It is a story about identity, betrayal, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever felt that subtle difference in a family, something almost imperceptible, but it gnaws at you day after day? For Prince Harry, that feeling started long before he could articulate it. As a child growing up in the ornate halls of Kensington Palace, surrounded by the polished rituals of royalty, there were moments that didn't quite align. Small, quiet inconsistencies. A glance from a nanny that lingered too long. A hushed conversation in a hallway that stopped abruptly when he entered. Whispers that seemed inconsequential at first, easy to dismiss. Yet as Harry grew older, they became impossible to ignore. Imagine knowing that the person the world calls your father, the man whose image is on magazines, coins, and state portraits, is the same person everyone expects you to mirror in appearance, mannerisms, and temperament. And then feeling, subtly, that you don't. It's in the details. Friends recall young Harry as different from William in ways that extended beyond personality. While William exuded the calm and measured composure expected of a future king, Harry was more impulsive, more outspoken, more prone to emotional swings. Some dismissed it as the natural variation between brothers, sibling contrast amplified by public scrutiny. Others, however, remember the whispers, the kind of remarks that are almost casual, yet heavy with implication. He takes after someone else, or there's something in him that doesn't quite match the family line. It wasn't spoken aloud in public, but in private moments, in the safe spaces between adults, it was there. And for Harry, these whispers were like tiny threads, weaving doubt into the fabric of his identity. Growing up, he tried to reconcile these contradictions internally. At boarding school, he was called a wild card by teachers. In the media, he was painted as the charming, cheeky prince, the one with the infectious laugh and sometimes reckless behavior. But behind closed doors, there was another narrative, an undercurrent of isolation, a quiet questioning. Why did he sometimes feel out of step? Why did he seem so different from William, not just in demeanor but in temperament, in instinct, in the way he navigated the world? The question lingered, unspoken, but persistent, like a shadow he could not shake. And shadows, as we know, grow longer in silence. Princess Diana, for all her strength and warmth, carried her own secrets and vulnerabilities. Friends and biographers have noted that she was intensely private about certain relationships, fiercely protective of her children, yet emotionally raw in other moments. Harry witnessed this duality firsthand, the tenderness and the volatility, the public smile masking private struggles. And while Diana tried to shield her children from palace politics, Harry could sense the undercurrents. The subtle tensions between adults, the sighs, the quiet conversations that paused as he approached. It was in those pauses that a child can sense more than he understands, a subtle clue that something was being withheld. How do you make sense of that as a 10-year-old? As a teenager? And how do you reconcile it when the world expects you to project confidence and joy, even as your foundation feels uncertain? The shadow of doubt was not only internal, it was amplified by the world outside. The media had long speculated about the royal family's inner dynamics, the contrasting personalities of the heirs, and the rumors that swirl in every palace. Magazines highlighted the differences between William and Harry, their looks, their behavior, their public personas. People pointed out the obvious. Harry was darker-haired, more fiery, more prone to breaking rules. But others noted the subtler signs, the expressions, the glances, the mannerisms that didn't perfectly align with official narratives. These external observations, though often framed as gossip, began to reinforce Harry's own quiet questions. Every newspaper, every headline, every photo that didn't quite add up became another brushstroke in the canvas of doubt. At the heart of this, however, was Harry's own instinct. Children are remarkably perceptive. They notice tone, timing, microexpressions. They remember fleeting details adults forget. And Harry, growing up under the relentless gaze of the press and the court, honed an instinct for reading people and situations. He felt the incongruities, the micro-moments where reality and appearances didn't match. When adults whispered, "You have your mother's eyes," or "You remind me of someone else," the phrasing, the pause, the glance, it all built a mosaic he could not yet interpret. It planted the seed of doubt that would, over decades, grow into an undeniable question. Who am I really, and where do I truly come from? School days, official engagements, family vacations, they all carried an invisible tension. Harry excelled at sports, showed remarkable bravery, but also carried a streak of rebellion that William did not. Teachers, friends, and staff often remarked on the difference. Was it nature or nurture? Was it simply personality, or something more? The whispers in the background of palace life suggested it could be the latter. But in public, nothing was ever confirmed. Nothing was ever acknowledged. And in that silence, doubt thrives. Imagine going through life with a question that you cannot ask, a truth that cannot be named, and the world insisting on one narrative while you feel another. That's the weight Harry carried silently, a burden invisible but persistent, shaping every relationship, every decision, every moment of self-reflection. There were moments of clarity, too, flashes when the puzzle pieces almost aligned. A look from a family friend, a fleeting comment from a relative, or the oddity of photographs across generations. Sometimes, the resemblance to other figures, unknown to the public, was startling. People whispered about similarities between Harry and men who were never officially recognized as part of the royal lineage. Whether these whispers were founded, speculative, or malicious, they entered Harry's consciousness, cementing an underlying tension. And Harry, ever intuitive, could sense the ripple effect these secrets had on the people around him. Diana's protective anxiety, Charles's quiet insistence on order, William's occasional defensiveness, and the palace staff's unspoken hierarchies. Each subtle interaction was a clue, a puzzle piece that didn't yet fit, but demanded attention. And so, the shadow of doubt stretched across his formative years. The world saw the public prince, the soldier, the philanthropist, the celebrity. But behind the curtain, the personal story was far more complex. Emotional turbulence became a constant companion. Harry learned early to navigate contradictions between duty and desire, expectation and instinct, truth and secrecy. He developed coping mechanisms, humor, charm, and sometimes defiance. But always, the questions lingered. What is my place in this family? Am I truly of this lineage? Am I accepted for who I am, or for the identity imposed upon me? These are questions that shape a person, mold character, and sometimes drive them to confront the world in extraordinary ways. By the time Harry reached adulthood, These questions had crystallized into a relentless curiosity and, at times, a simmering anger. The moments that had once been subtle became unavoidable. Comparisons to William, whispers in the press, the constant scrutiny of every action. And while many might have turned inward, Harry learned to project, to engage, to use public appearances as a shield while privately wrestling with the truths that lay beneath. It's a remarkable tension, living publicly as a prince while privately questioning the very foundation of your identity. Can you imagine what that does to a person, day after day, year after year? How it shapes relationships, choices, and sense of self. For Harry, the shadow of doubt was a defining element of his life, shaping the man he would become and the revelation he would eventually deliver to the world. But what came next would take that shadow and transform it into a storm. A revelation that would shatter assumptions, redefine family ties, and alter the course of history. And this was only the beginning of Harry's journey into truth, into the world behind the palace walls, and into the secret that would finally see the light of day. What would you do if someone handed you proof that challenged the very core of your identity? Imagine holding a document that could unravel decades of assumption, love, loyalty, and family bonds. For Prince Harry, that moment arrived in a way that was as clandestine as it was shocking. The whispers from childhood had grown into persistent questions over the years, but it wasn't until an anonymous source presented the possibility of a DNA test that the abstract fear became tangible, concrete, undeniable. Can you picture the tension in that room, the quiet whispers of assistance, the hurried glance of a confidant, the envelope or file that contained the kind of information no one in the palace ever expects to see? It started quietly. Harry had long confided in Meghan, his closest advisors, and a handful of trusted allies about the lingering questions that had shadowed his life. Some dismissed it as paranoia, some as overthinking, but Harry had long felt there was a pattern too consistent to ignore. The differences from William, the subtle shifts in resemblance over generations, the unspoken remarks from family friends, staff, and even casual acquaintances, it all formed a mosaic too detailed to simply forget. Yet the leap from suspicion to proof required more than observation. It demanded a test, one that in the royal world is the stuff of nightmares. The test itself was conducted in secrecy, under conditions that would make most people sweat with anxiety. DNA testing in the royal family is not like a simple lab procedure. It requires discretion, meticulous care, and the utmost secrecy. Imagine the stress. Every sample, every swab, every analysis scrutinized not just for accuracy, but for discretion. The potential consequences of exposure were monumental. A leak could destabilize the monarchy, create international headlines, and forever alter family dynamics. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on everyone involved, making each breath feel heavy, each step calculated, each conversation measured. And yet, Harry's desire for clarity outweighed any fear. He needed answers. The results, when they finally arrived, were almost anticlimactic in their silence. A simple report, clinical in tone, stark in implication, yet carrying the emotional weight of centuries of lineage and legacy. Harry stared at the data in disbelief, then anger, then sorrow. This was the confirmation that the questions of his youth, the suspicions whispered across corridors, and the doubts that had plagued his private moments were real. The man the world recognized as his father, the king of his childhood imagination and the focus of his public life, was not the man who had contributed the DNA that made him who he was. Can you imagine the whirlwind of emotions, relief, betrayal, sorrow, and confusion, colliding all at once in a single moment? What makes this even more extraordinary is how the palace attempted to contain the fallout. Those entrusted with the secret acted with a mix of panic, calculation, and loyalty. Instructions were whispered, documents shredded, and staff reminded of their oaths of confidentiality. Even within these hallowed walls, human error is unavoidable, and the tension was palpable. Harry, who had long been aware of palace maneuvering, now experienced it firsthand in a way he had never imagined. The very system designed to protect tradition and image now became a cage, one in which truth, however personal, was considered dangerous. How do you navigate that environment when the truth you seek threatens to disrupt everything? And yet, the irony is unavoidable. The monarchy, with all its grandeur, its protocols, and its emphasis on lineage, could not escape the same biological reality that affects every human being. Genetics do not bend to tradition. They do not respect titles or power. And in this case, they revealed a truth so stark it could no longer remain hidden. Harry's relief in finally knowing the truth was tempered by the enormity of its implications. Who was the man who had truly fathered him? What did this mean for his identity? For his children? For the future of a family steeped in tradition and expectation? These were questions that demanded answers, yet answers came with risk. Even before public disclosure, Harry faced a private reckoning. The knowledge reshaped his memories. Childhood moments took on new meanings. Affections, conflicts, and comparisons that had once seemed minor suddenly carried weight. He replayed events in his mind. The subtle differences from William, the seemingly casual remarks from adults, the moments when he felt misunderstood or out of place. Each memory became a lens through which the truth now filtered, transforming the familiar into something strange and complex. Can you imagine having your own history rewritten in real time by a revelation of this magnitude? The test also introduced complications with intermediaries. There were advisors, private detectives, and loyal staff who were all brought in to facilitate the process, each with their own motivations and stakes. Some sought to protect the family image, others the monarchy's reputation, and some had their own agendas entirely. Trust became a scarce commodity. Every conversation, every glance, every action was loaded with suspicion. How do you navigate an environment where even those closest to you may have conflicting loyalties? For Harry, this was a test not just of truth, but of judgment, discretion, and resilience. The stakes were personal, familial, and global all at once. The emotional complexity of the revelation cannot be overstated. The DNA results did more than confirm suspicion. They disrupted the entire framework of identity. Harry had to reconcile the love he felt for the man who raised him with the reality of biological truth. He had to grapple with feelings of betrayal, not only for himself but for his family, for the perception of the monarchy, and for the legacy of Princess Diana. The irony of loving someone who is not your biological parent is profound. It challenges conventional notions of parenthood, loyalty, and affection. How do you honor the relationship you have had while acknowledging a truth that shifts its foundation? And then there was the question of disclosure. Should he reveal the results publicly, privately, or only to select family members? Each choice carried consequences. Public disclosure risked a media storm and possible estrangement. Private disclosure could preserve family relationships, but might leave rumors festering. Secrecy could protect the institution temporarily, but would weigh heavily on Harry, a man who values honesty, integrity, and agency over his own story. These choices were not academic. They were existential, impacting not just Harry but the perception of the royal family, the media narrative, and historical record. How does one weigh personal truth against centuries of tradition and expectation? Ultimately, the DNA test was more than a scientific procedure, it was a catalyst. It transformed suspicion into certainty, shadows into clarity, and private unease into public consequence. It marked the moment when Harry could no longer remain silent, when the threads of doubt that had been woven over decades demanded resolution. And yet, even with clarity, the storm had only just begun. The palace, the public, and Harry's own inner circle would all react in ways unpredictable, volatile, and dramatic. How do you prepare for the avalanche of consequences unleashed by a single, undeniable truth? The test was the hinge on which Harry's life pivoted. Before, he moved in a world of speculation, intuition, and whispered doubts. Afterward, he moved in a world of fact, consequence, and reckoning. Each step he took from that moment was laden with meaning, each decision weighted by the knowledge that his identity and the family's narrative had shifted irrevocably. How do you navigate life when the ground beneath you, once solid and familiar, turns out to be something else entirely? For Harry, this was not just a personal journey. It was a historical turning point, one that would reverberate through the monarchy, the media, and the lives of millions around the globe. But the story didn't end with the receipt of the test results. The real challenge was about what Harry would do next, who he would confide in, how he would protect himself and his family, and when, if ever, he would make this revelation public. And what happened in the moments that followed, the confrontations, the secrecy, the calculations, would set the stage for a storm that no palace protocol could contain. How do you confront a truth that shakes the very foundation of your life? Imagine staring into a mirror and realizing that the reflection you've always trusted doesn't tell the whole story. For Prince Harry, the moment after discovering the DNA results was more than a personal reckoning. It was a confrontation with a reality that had been hidden for decades. It was one thing to harbor suspicions, to notice subtle differences from William, or to sense unspoken tensions in the palace. It was another entirely to have undeniable proof in your hands, proof that your life, your identity, your very existence had been viewed through a lens of omission and secrecy. How do you even begin to process that? Harry's first instinct was a rush of disbelief, a sharp, visceral reaction that made him question everything he had ever known. Could this be real? Could the test be flawed? Was it a mistake, a deliberate deception, or something beyond his comprehension? The mind races in moments like these, grasping for rationality, for some shred of certainty in a storm of emotional upheaval. But the clarity of the test was inescapable. Every scenario, every what-if, led him back to the same inescapable conclusion. The man he had called father for 40 years was not his biological parent. The weight of that knowledge is staggering. You carry not just the knowledge of fact, but the emotional burden of what it means for every relationship, every memory, every assumption about who you are. The private moments that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. Harry turned inward, replaying scenes from his childhood. Family holidays, school events, private conversations with his mother, the quiet guidance of Charles in his youth. Every smile, every reprimand, every hug, every argument took on new meaning. Was it love? Was it duty? Was it something else? And yet, the love he had always felt, the bond that had been cultivated over years, remained. Confronting truth doesn't erase affection, it complicates it. It forces a nuanced understanding of people, their motivations, and the messy intersection of biology and relationship. How do you honor a man who raised you, taught you, guided you, even when the biology doesn't align with your expectations? Meghan was by his side during this moment, an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. She had seen Harry navigate public scrutiny, media attacks, and personal turmoil, but this was different. This was raw, intimate, and deeply transformative. Their private conversations became lifelines, moments to process not just the information, but the implications. Harry, who had spent so much of his life mediating between expectation and desire, tradition and truth, had to decide what this revelation meant for his future, his family, and his voice. Meghan's presence was not just supportive, it was grounding, a reminder that truth, no matter how disruptive, could be faced with courage, partnership, and strategy. Could Harry confront this alone? Perhaps not. Could he confront it with the world? That decision would come later, but in these moments, clarity was forged in intimacy. What makes Harry's confrontation with the truth even more compelling is how it intersected with his ongoing life in the public eye. He is, after all, a prince, a man whose every action, expression, and decision is observed, recorded, and analyzed. Yet the internal reckoning he faced was deeply private. He had to reconcile his identity as a royal, as a public figure, with his private identity as a son, as a husband, as a father, and now as someone whose very lineage had been questioned. The contradictions were immense: loyalty versus truth, duty versus self, public image versus private reality. How do you navigate a world where perception is almost as important as reality, when revealing the truth can shift the narrative of a centuries-old institution? The confrontation wasn't only internal. Harry had to consider the reactions of those around him, the family members, the palace staff, the close confidants who had served him and the monarchy for decades. Each interaction carried a subtle tension, a balancing act between protecting relationships and honoring truth. There were questions he asked himself constantly. How much do I reveal? Who do I trust? How do I maintain dignity while confronting betrayal or omission? Each decision was fraught with risk. One wrong word, one misplaced conversation, and the ripple effects could become uncontainable. And yet, the alternative, silence, suppression, denial, was unsustainable. The truth demanded confrontation, and Harry had no choice but to face it. This period also revealed the depth of Harry's emotional intelligence and resilience. He experienced shock, anger, sadness, grief, and even moments of ironic detachment as he considered the absurdity of the situation. The juxtaposition of royal protocol and human vulnerability is striking. Here is a man who has been trained in etiquette, diplomacy, and composure, confronting a deeply personal truth that defies structure and order. Can you imagine holding back tears, controlling expression, and maintaining composure when the world expects perfection from every gesture? That is the life of a royal confronting not just personal revelation, but a seismic disruption of family narrative. Yet even amidst emotional turmoil, Harry began to strategize. The truth could not exist in isolation. It had consequences, and every move he made would have reverberations. Private meetings were held with trusted advisors, confidants who had long served him, and Meghan, his partner and co-strategist in this extraordinary journey. Each plan was weighed against emotional cost, public perception, and historical consequence. Harry's confrontation with the truth was thus not merely emotional. It was tactical, a careful navigation of one of the most delicate personal and familial revelations imaginable. How do you plan for consequences that span decades, institutions, and media scrutiny, all while maintaining your own emotional equilibrium? As Harry processed the revelation, memories of his mother, Princess Diana, surfaced with acute clarity. Diana had always been fiercely protective of her children, and her untimely death had left Harry navigating adolescence and early adulthood without her guidance. Now, the revelation of his paternity cast those formative experiences in a new light. Could she have suspected? Could she have shielded him? Was this knowledge something she had quietly feared or anticipated? The emotional resonance of these questions added another layer to Harry's confrontation. He was not just confronting Charles, the palace, or public perception. He was confronting the legacy of loss, grief, and maternal protection. How does one reconcile the truth with absence, the knowledge with memory, the reality with imagination? In these private confrontations with himself and with Meghan, Harry also confronted his own identity as a father. How would this knowledge affect Archie and Lilibet, his children? Could he shield them from the complexities of adult revelations? Or was it inevitable that the truths of lineage and legacy would become part of their story as well? Every decision carried generational implications, influencing not just his own life, but the narrative of his family for years to come. How do you make choices that are simultaneously personal and historical, intimate and public? By the end of this period, Harry had confronted not just a fact, but the broader implications of what it meant to be a prince, a son, and a man with his own agency. The internal reckoning had transformed into preparation for external confrontation. He had to decide how and when to disclose the truth, who to trust with it, and how to maintain his integrity in the face of potential backlash. Every consideration was intensified by the public scrutiny that comes with royal life, a constant presence that amplifies every emotional spike, every private decision, into global spectacle. Confronting the truth, for Harry, was a multifaceted challenge: emotional, relational, tactical, and existential. And yet, even after internal confrontation, even after conversations with Meghan and trusted advisors, even after replaying childhood memories and imagining potential future fallout, there was still the unanswered question of the palace's response. How would Charles react? William? Catherine? The advisors and staff who have long guarded the family's image? The confrontation had prepared Harry for himself, but not for the storm of reaction that was inevitably coming. How do you predict the unpredictability of those invested in tradition, image, and hierarchy? How do you navigate a system where power, secrecy, and emotion intersect in ways that are both fragile and explosive? And in the quiet moments before any action was taken, Harry felt the weight of isolation. He knew that revealing the truth would change relationships irreversibly, that some bonds might fracture, and that the world would judge him in ways that were impossible to anticipate. But silence was no longer an option. The confrontation had brought clarity, and clarity demanded courage. And as Harry steeled himself for the next steps, conversations, disclosures, and the potential public announcement, he realized something profound. Knowing the truth is only the first step. Acting on it, living it, and owning it is the real challenge. But what happened when Harry finally took that step? When he began navigating the palace's reaction and confronting his family with the undeniable truth, would ignite a sequence of events that no one could contain. What happens when a secret buried for decades finally surfaces in the heart of the monarchy? Imagine the ornate corridors of Buckingham Palace, steeped in centuries of tradition, suddenly reverberating with whispers of a revelation so seismic it could shake the foundations of the institution itself. The DNA results in Harry's possession were not just a private matter. They threatened the very image of the royal family. The palace, a world accustomed to ceremony, protocol, and controlled narratives, now faced a storm unlike any it had prepared for. How do you respond when the walls you've relied upon for order are suddenly pierced by the truth? The first reaction inside the palace was disbelief. Advisors, secretaries, and aides who had long served in loyalty were confronted with the unthinkable. Could it really be true? Could the bloodline of a prince, heir in the public eye, be called into question? The shock wasn't just about genetics. It was about history, legacy, and the fragile equilibrium of power. Courtiers whispered to one another. Glances were exchanged in corridors usually devoid of candid discussion, and every gesture, every expression, carried hidden meaning. For a family that operates in ritual and symbolism, the disruption was profound. The very foundations of trust within these walls were being tested. Charles, whose public image emphasized stability, wisdom, and paternal guidance, now faced the private reality of a son whose lineage was questioned. Sources close to the palace describe a complex mix of emotions: shock, denial, anger, and a meticulous attempt to control damage. Can you imagine trying to reconcile decades of fatherhood, public appearances, and personal relationships with the knowledge that a biological truth undermines it? The monarchy is built on perception as much as reality, and here, perception and fact collided violently. Each advisor, each secretary, understood that how Charles reacted would set the tone for the family, the press, and public opinion. One misstep could ignite global speculation and scandal. Within the palace, a flurry of activity began almost immediately. Confidential meetings were convened behind closed doors. Trusted advisors were tasked with assessing the situation, planning contingencies, and weighing the potential fallout of every possible action. Documents were reviewed, historical precedents searched for, and legal teams consulted. Every decision was calculated, every conversation carefully orchestrated to prevent leaks. But secrecy is a delicate thread. One misstep and the entire narrative could unravel. And in a palace where information flows in layers, the question of who knew what and when became a matter of strategic importance. The tension was almost tangible, like a pressure cooker about to blow. Meanwhile, the human element complicated everything. Staff members, long loyal and devoted, were caught between duty and personal conscience. Some felt a moral obligation to speak, to protect the truth, while others prioritized institutional loyalty, fearing the consequences of exposure. Every glance, every hushed comment, every sudden silence carried the weight of judgment. Imagine navigating an environment where one word could shift power, reputations, and relationships permanently. For Harry, this was a nightmare scenario in miniature. A private revelation with public stakes and a labyrinthine hierarchy that could either protect or betray him, depending on a single conversation. William, too, became an unexpected focal point. Known for his measured demeanor and meticulous approach to family affairs, he was forced to reconcile his public image as a future king with the private reality of a brother whose very identity challenged established narratives. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, punctuated by brief, pointed interactions in family meetings and private corridors. Can you imagine the strain in those encounters? Every word, every glance, every gesture loaded with subtext, every moment a test of loyalty, restraint, and emotional control. And then there were the unintended consequences of the revelation. Even before public disclosure, the palace felt tremors of uncertainty. Rumors began to circulate among staff. Subtle hints slipped through channels that had long been considered secure. The monarchy's image relies heavily on control of narrative, control of access, control of perception. But truth has a way of leaking through even the tightest gates. The palace was suddenly forced to confront the fragile human elements that underpin every institution: trust, discretion, and the unpredictability of human behavior. And Harry, aware of every movement, every glance, every whisper, understood that his private knowledge was a catalyst capable of unleashing chaos. Amid the strategizing, emotional responses were raw and unfiltered behind closed doors. Sources describe a mix of frustration, disbelief, and urgency. Advisors debated whether to contain the information within the family or prepare for an inevitable leak. The palace had faced scandals before, but never one that directly called into question the legitimacy of a royal bloodline. Every decision carried immense risk. One wrong word, one misjudged reaction, and the situation could spiral into a global controversy. The stakes were monumental, and the pressure was relentless. Imagine making choices under that kind of scrutiny, where personal, familial, and historical consequences collide. At the same time, the psychological toll on Harry became evident. Watching the palace react, maneuver, and strategize around him was both validating and alienating. On one hand, it underscored the magnitude of his revelation. On the other, it highlighted the distance between him and the institution that had defined his life. He was no longer just a son seeking answers. He was a disruptor, a force capable of reshaping perceptions, relationships, and history. And in this tension, he had to navigate not only the palace's reactions but his own emotions: anger, relief, grief, and the faint flicker of vindication. How does one reconcile love for a father figure with the shock of biological betrayal? How does one prepare to act when the world itself seems unprepared for the truth? Public perception loomed over every internal palace discussion. Even if the news remained secret temporarily, the knowledge existed in the minds of those closest to Harry. The palace understood that control was tenuous. Once information leaked, the media storm would be unstoppable. The irony was stark. An institution built on centuries of protocol, hierarchy, and disciplined presentation suddenly found itself vulnerable to the very human element it sought to manage. Leaks, miscommunication, and emotional reactions threatened to dismantle decades of carefully constructed image. Harry's revelation, though private, had created an unstoppable momentum toward public scrutiny, whether the palace liked it or not. And yet, amidst the tension and strategizing, there were moments of candid human emotion. Sources report fleeting expressions of regret, moments of private grief, and unspoken acknowledgments of the magnitude of what had occurred. The palace staff, advisors, and family members all experienced a collision of duty, loyalty, and personal feeling. The realization that an entire family narrative might be fundamentally altered created ripples of introspection. How do you reconcile decades of tradition with an unchangeable truth? How do you navigate the delicate balance of love, loyalty, and truth in a world where appearances have always mattered? But the palace's reaction was only the beginning. For Harry, the revelation demanded action, strategy, and courage. The internal storm of emotions, coupled with the palace's carefully measured responses, set the stage for an inevitable confrontation, one that would force Harry to make decisions that could not be undone. How do you prepare for a family reckoning of this magnitude? How do you anticipate the reactions of a brother, a father figure, and a staff accustomed to protocol rather than upheaval? The palace's response was immediate, intense, and unpredictable, creating a pressure cooker that would test loyalty, judgment, and resilience. And just when the tension seemed unmanageable, a first leak threatened to pierce the palace's defenses, a small but potent ripple hinting at the storm to come. The reaction was swift. Advisors scrambled, conversations were intensified, and private meetings convened at an unprecedented pace. But the die was cast. Harry's revelation had begun to reshape the narrative within Buckingham Palace, and the internal mechanisms designed to contain scandal were now working against themselves. The palace, accustomed to controlling every detail of perception, was suddenly exposed to the unpredictability of truth. What happened next, when the first threads of this revelation began to weave into public awareness, would escalate the conflict in ways no one inside the palace could have predicted, forcing brothers, advisors, and kings-to-be to confront a truth that had long been whispered but never spoken aloud. What happens when blood ties are tested by betrayal, secrecy, and revelation? For Prince Harry and Prince William, the question became unavoidable. Brothers once bound by shared childhoods, shared responsibilities, and shared public scrutiny suddenly found themselves standing on opposite sides of a divide they never anticipated. Can you imagine the tension, the unspoken words, the glances heavy with implication? Imagine two men who grew up under the same roof, who learned the same protocols, shared the same parents, and yet now had to confront a truth that redefined everything they thought they knew. Not only about their family, but about themselves. The revelation of Harry's DNA results did not arrive in isolation. It collided with decades of sibling dynamics, from playful rivalry to subtle competition, amplified by public attention. William had always been the heir, the one groomed meticulously to inherit the monarchy, with a life defined by duty, expectation, and scrutiny. Harry, meanwhile, had grown up in the shadow of that role, carving his own path, navigating the contradictions between familial obligation and personal identity, often testing boundaries and challenging protocol. These differences, which had once been tolerable, suddenly became stark points of contrast in light of the revelation. How does a brother process a truth that shakes the foundation of familial hierarchy and expectation? The first private confrontation between the brothers reportedly occurred quietly, in a room away from the cameras, away from aides and advisors. The atmosphere was thick, almost tangible. William, known for his composure, was described as controlled, measured, but beneath that control simmered an undercurrent of shock, hurt, and betrayal. How could his younger brother keep such a monumental secret for so long? How could Harry carry a truth of such magnitude and not confide in the one person he had shared his life with most intimately? The questions, though unspoken, hung in the air like heavy smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Harry, on the other hand, carried a storm of emotions of his own. The release of truth, while liberating, also came with the recognition that familial bonds could be strained, fractured, or forever altered. He was not confronting William as a rival or an adversary, but as someone whose life and expectations were now deeply entwined with his own revelation. Can you imagine the empathy mixed with fear, the desire to bridge the gap, mixed with the inevitability of tension? The conversation, when it finally unfolded, was a delicate dance between honesty, emotion, and the unspoken rules of royalty. Every word had weight. Every gesture had significance. And yet, the emotional reality could not be fully contained by protocol. The palace, aware of the underlying tension between the brothers, approached the situation with caution. Advisors encouraged discretion, suggesting private counseling, mediation, and controlled communication. Yet, the human element is not so easily managed. Brothers who had once been aligned by shared experiences, secrets, and family rituals now found themselves navigating mistrust, misunderstanding, and conflicting loyalties. Can you imagine the complexity of trying to reconcile love with anger, duty with resentment, and the past with an altered present? The dynamics that had seemed stable for decades were suddenly fragile, unstable, and highly sensitive to misinterpretation. Social media and the press, though not yet aware of the full scope, amplified tension indirectly. Observers noticed subtle body language at public events, analyzed interactions, and speculated on the nature of their relationship. Every shared smile, every brief conversation, every formal handshake became a subject of scrutiny. The brothers had to navigate the dual pressures of private tension and public perception simultaneously. The irony was sharp. The institution that demanded composure, secrecy, and loyalty now found its most intimate relationships dissected on a global stage, magnifying every minor inconsistency into a headline, a meme, or a viral moment. The emotional stakes were equally high. For William, The revelation was a jolt to his understanding of family history, expectations, and the hierarchy he was groomed to maintain. For Harry, it was a confrontation with not just the palace, but with the brother who had been his confidant, ally, and occasional competitor throughout life. Trust had to be renegotiated. Conversations had to be recalibrated. Boundaries had to be reassessed. And amidst all this, the brothers were acutely aware that every move, every word, every gesture would be interpreted, analyzed, and remembered, both privately and publicly. Memories of childhood came flooding back during these confrontations. Moments of shared mischief, arguments over toys, competitions in school, family vacations, all were filtered through the lens of new knowledge. Harry began to see old interactions in a different light, wondering if some were influenced by secrets kept from him or by unspoken truths he had not known. William, likewise, had to reconcile long-standing perceptions of his younger brother with a reality that challenged the assumptions that had governed their relationship for decades. How do you navigate a bond that is both lifelong and fundamentally altered by information previously hidden? Therapists, confidants, and private advisors reportedly suggested careful pacing, controlled conversation, and deliberate reflection. Yet, emotion is not easily scheduled. Outbursts, moments of tearful vulnerability, and flashes of anger punctuated the otherwise controlled dialogue between the brothers. Can you imagine the intensity of negotiating loyalty, sibling love, and personal betrayal in a room where the stakes are both personal and institutional? Every sentence had to balance honesty with diplomacy, emotion with strategy, and past history with present reality. The confrontation was not just emotional, it was strategic. Each brother was aware that their actions would have ripple effects on their parents, on the children, on the staff, and on the global public. Harry had to weigh the consequences of every disclosure, every reaction, every choice. William had to assess not only his feelings toward his brother, but also the implications for his role as future king. The interplay between personal truth and public responsibility became a complex calculus, with no easy answers, no guaranteed outcomes, and no way to return to the previous status quo. Even within private spaces, the tension was palpable. Small gestures, a hesitation before a handshake, a pause in conversation, a deliberate avoidance of eye contact, communicated volumes. Emotional beats punctuated the dialogue. Regret, anger, confusion, fear, empathy, and occasional laughter born of shared history. These moments, while fleeting, underscored the complexity of their relationship. Love intertwined with resentment, loyalty entangled with frustration, connection shadowed by revelation. How does one maintain brotherhood when every word carries both personal and historical weight? And then there was the broader context of the family. Charles, the advisors, and palace staff all watched, aware that the brothers' interactions would shape not only the immediate fallout, but also the narrative of the monarchy for years to come. Each decision about dialogue, disclosure, and emotional expression had consequences extending far beyond the room in which it occurred. The stakes were simultaneously intimate and global. Harry and William's relationship was a linchpin, and every nuance had potential reverberations across the family, the monarchy, and public perception. But as the confrontation unfolded, it became clear that the path forward was not simply reconciliation or denial. It required negotiation, patience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. The brothers had to balance love with honesty, vulnerability with strategy, and emotion with calculation. Each step was deliberate, yet emotionally charged, a delicate dance that required both courage and restraint. And just when it seemed that some equilibrium might be achieved, a small but explosive incident, an unguarded comment, a misinterpreted gesture, a leaked whisper, threatened to reignite the tension, pulling the brothers toward a confrontation with consequences that no one inside or outside the palace could predict. The delicate balance of brotherhood, trust, and loyalty had reached a tipping point. What would happen next, when private disagreements collided with palace politics and the first subtle hints of public knowledge began to emerge? That tension was only the beginning of a storm that would engulf the brothers and the monarchy entirely. If Charles wasn't Harry's biological father, then who was? That question became an obsession, a shadowy thread running through every conversation, every memory, every whisper in palace corridors. The mere possibility was explosive, a secret that could shatter the carefully constructed image of a family and a monarchy, a truth hidden behind decades of appearances and expectation. Imagine living with a question like this, knowing that your very identity might be entwined with someone the world has never seen, never acknowledged, never spoken about. Who was this man, and what did he mean to Harry, to Diana, to the royal family? Sources close to the palace have long hinted that Diana's private life was complex, nuanced, and often misunderstood. Friends described her as fiercely independent, intensely private, and emotionally intricate. She navigated a world of tradition and expectation while maintaining relationships and making choices that were deeply personal. Some of these choices, whispered about in private letters and private conversations, suggested connections to figures who were outside the official royal narrative. And for Harry, these hints became pieces of a puzzle he had long been trying to solve. Could it be that someone from Diana's life, someone her confidants whispered about, had left an indelible mark on his own DNA? The identity of the hidden father figure was the subject of endless speculation, fueled by diaries, private letters, and testimonies from those closest to Diana. Some described a man of intelligence, charisma, and discretion, someone who existed on the margins of the palace's watchful gaze, someone who could interact with Diana without drawing undue attention. Others spoke of a fleeting presence, a ghost in the background, whose existence was barely documented yet profoundly influential. The secrecy surrounding him only intensified the mystique. Can you imagine being Harry, piecing together childhood memories, fleeting interactions, and whispers from adults, trying to identify a man who, by all appearances, was invisible? For Harry, discovering this hidden figure's existence was both liberating and devastating. Liberating, because it explained patterns he had long felt but could never articulate, his personality traits, his temperament, his instincts, even certain physical resemblances. Devastating, because it underscored the layers of secrecy and deception that had been maintained around him. Every childhood interaction, every family gathering, every conversation with advisors or relatives now carried a different weight. Moments that had seemed trivial or routine were now potentially evidence of a reality long obscured. How do you reconcile love, loyalty, and affection with the knowledge that your biological origin is not what you had believed? The palace, aware of the possibility that attention might eventually shift toward this hidden figure, acted with urgency. Staff and advisors worked to control information, maintain secrecy, and ensure that speculation remained contained. Every detail of the narrative had to be managed, from private correspondence to media oversight. And yet, controlling human curiosity is nearly impossible. Even in the shadows, rumors can grow, distort, and take on lives of their own. The existence of a hidden father figure, whether publicly acknowledged or not, was now a catalyst for tension, mistrust, and emotional volatility. For William, this revelation complicated his role not only as a brother, but as heir. Suddenly, the monarchy's narrative was fragile. What had once been unquestionable, the legitimacy of succession, the clarity of lineage, was now layered with uncertainty. The presence of an unknown father figure introduced not just familial complexity, but potential political and historical ramifications. How do you navigate a world where assumptions about bloodlines, tradition, and duty are suddenly destabilized? How do you preserve loyalty, protect reputation, and manage your own emotions when the foundation of your family history is uncertain? Harry, in private, began to reconstruct memories and moments that had long puzzled him. He revisited old photographs, comparing features, gestures, and expressions. He analyzed patterns of behavior, personality traits, and emotional responses. Every anecdote from friends, family, and staff became a potential clue. The process was painstaking, obsessive, and emotionally exhausting. Can you imagine spending years reconstructing the invisible threads of your own origin story, trying to make sense of what had been deliberately hidden or quietly omitted? The hidden father figure was more than just a person. He was a symbol of the secrecy, the contradictions, and the hidden realities that had defined Harry's life. His existence forced Harry to confront questions about identity, agency, and legacy. How much of who he was had been shaped by assumption rather than truth? How do you integrate a new, previously unknown paternal figure into a life already filled with complex relationships and expectations? The emotional weight of this knowledge was staggering, and Harry approached it with a combination of curiosity, caution, and resolve. Meanwhile, the palace worked tirelessly to prevent the identity from reaching